Greetings, my fellow Americans, and welcome to another episode of the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast. Tonight we're going to be talking about government-imposed restrictions, particularly on those whom it considers disfavorable, most particularly felons or convicts or whatever you want to call them. And before we get into tonight's discussion, I would like to remind you that if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe, share the video. The more people we get watching this, the more exposure we get, the better opportunity we get a chance to get our message out there. And of course, if you like what we're doing, by all means, look at the information that's attached to this video about how you can help support our cause. If you need to go back and find out where this podcast originates, by all means, go back to the original source at monspiracy.podbean.com. Now, as I mentioned, what we're talking about tonight are government-imposed restrictions. Now, I've talked about in the last several podcasts about the high rate of convictions that the United States and Montana have as a whole. Montana has by far the greatest per capita incarcerations in the world, literally in the world. It has more incarcerations even than the United States average per capita incarceration, and the United States grossly exceeds any industrialized democracy in the world. And as with the last week's episode, I discussed the reason behind it is the prison for profit. The idea that there is profit to be made because the federal government has passed down to the states billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars over the last several decades to help build this prison infrastructure, and they need bodies to fill them. And states like Montana have taken this as a blank check. They don't care about what's fair, what's equal. They don't care about actually pursuing justice or actually breaking down the aspects of criminality. What they want are bodies to fill the beds so they can claim they have people in their jails, they have people in their prisons, so they can collect these federal dollars. That's all it comes down to. It's about money, numbers, and everything else. It's not about people. It's not about crimes. Not as an overall concept. Certainly there are actual criminals who are prosecuted. I'm not saying that every person put into prison is innocent. Not by stretch of the imagination. There are many, many, many guilty people in prison. However, the overcriminalization has given the opportunity to Montana to simply put people in prison just because the number of people if you take an opportunity to review the individual cases in Montana and actually review the people who actually took plea deals just to try to get out from under the yoke of threat, of punitive, to try to get their lives back, to try to get some semblance of normalcy back in their lives, who are just scared. I don't want to use foul language on my podcast, but you can imagine the expletive I want to use. They're scared because they just don't want to go to prison. They don't want the harsher penalty. They're scared. They're intimidated. You have a state that takes away your grand jury. You have a state that that applies excessive bails, that keeps you in prison for 6 to 12 months, maybe even longer, on a charge you may not have even committed. Even the local jail will say on its website that most inmates detained are in pre-trial detention. Without ever being convicted of a crime, they're being held indefinitely until they either break and take a plea deal, which in most cases they break and take a plea deal because they can't handle being in jail, or they manage to get the small percentage of them through trial, and of course that's another run-of-the-mill kangaroo court system. It's all about running people through a factory and putting people in prison. As a consequence, you have a massive population of felons. And felons, as I've mentioned before, when you have a conviction on your record, would be a misdemeanor, a felony, whatever else, in today's day and age, it's a life sentence. Regardless where the penalty ends at the moment you're released with no further consequences, no further limitations, it's now in a background check. Felons lose rights. Many people with misdemeanors lose rights. They're not citizens. They become a lower caste. A caste below the lowest and most impoverished individuals of the country are felons or convicts, people who've been convicted of crimes who have not had an opportunity to receive fair treatment afterwards. In other countries, it's actually illegal to publish the name of somebody who's been accused or convicted of a crime. Only confidentiality measures allow for it, allow for its release, and then only to proper authorities, not to the public. There's an entire mass media industry that relies upon this, is funneled by this, fueled by this, profits off of this. Because let's face it, what gets better media attention than the boy down the street who's going to prison? This person's accused of this person's accused of that, and as a consequence, the media influences the public. The public comes in with a preconception, and it's very hard to get a fair shake, even if in the most fair judiciary in the country. And I'd be very hard pressed to find where that is. But hey, I'll give you guys a challenge. You find me what you think is the fairest judiciary in the country. Yeah, contact me, send it out, shout it out to me. Let me know who you think the fairest judiciary is. I'll gladly review them, interview them, talk to them, see what their record is. Let's find out. Let's see if we can find an actual fair judiciary in the United States. I know you won't find one in Montana, but let's try to find somewhere else in the United States. Maybe we can have like the counterpoint. You know, you have the movie Unbreakable, I think is what it's called. Bruce Willis. Um, he he has this ability. He's basically the highest echelon, one spectrum of humanity, who is impervious to harm. And you have Samuel L. Jackson, who plays Mr. Glass, who is incredibly fragile. Just the slightest little bump will break a bone. And you have this differing spectrum. We have Montana, which is the Mr. Glass, just so fragile because it's just there's no civil rights recognized here at all. And then you have somewhere else in the country. Let's find it. Please don't blow up any trains, planes, or automobiles in the process of trying to find the perfect impervious judiciary. And anybody who's seen the movie will understand that. At any rate, let's get back to the point of the podcast tonight. There are consequences of overcriminalizing the American justice system, and I've said this all along. But the most significant one is how it affects the individuals, and as individuals, they become a mass class of people, or, to put it another way, they become an undesirable caste of people. They lose their rights for their lives, many times, lifetime penalties, lifetime punishments, as a consequence of a conviction of a felony. Regardless of whether they're innocent or guilty, regardless of whether they have any chance of rehabilitation, they have a lifetime penalty. If you have a 16-year-old who has a doobie in his pocket, and for anybody who knows, a doobie is slang for a joint or a rolled up marijuana cigarette, okay, just happens to have it in his pocket, gets patted down by the cops at 16. That arrest will be on his record till he's 80. It will affect his ability to get employment. It'll affect his ability to go to school. It'll affect his ability to have any kind of public recognition or public status. His drug record could be pulled up if he tries to run for office, if he tries to do anything in the general public. Anything, it will be used to downplay him because he had a conviction for a one little marijuana cigarette in his pocket when he was 16. Now, let's say you're walking along the street and you find some plastic bags on the ground. You go, hey, plastic bags, I can kind of use these. You walk down half a block, cop pulls you over, says, hey, I saw you pick up that stash back there. You find out that the bags have residue in them. You didn't know. You just picked them off the ground. You thought you could clean them up, use them, reuse them. Now you've got you never used drugs in your life. Now you've got a conviction for possession of residue. Not even actual drugs, just residue. Congratulations, it's going to hang over your life for the rest of your life. It's not just background checks. I mean, seriously, voting. American democracy counts on the right to vote. There's so much out there in public perception and public propaganda. You know, let's get people out to vote. Let's get people out to vote. Except don't vote if you're a felon in many states. Don't vote if you're incarcerated in just about every state. It's called felony disenfranchisement. There's actually a term for it. In Montana, voting actually is restored once you're released from prison. I can vote. Amazingly enough, yes, I can vote. And I do, every single time. I always honor that. I have not missed a voting opportunity in my entire adult life, both pre and post conviction and release. I have never missed an opportunity to vote. I cherish it above all else. Does my one voice count for nothing? Probably not in most cases, but ironically enough, true story, I did vote myself into a Democratic committee seat in Polson several years ago. As I've mentioned in the past, whenever I come to a ballot and I either don't like the candidate or I'm protesting the fact that nobody's running for the office, I will write my own name as a protest vote. I voted myself into a Democratic committee seat in Polson because no one else was running for it and no one else wrote anything on the line. It is possible for one vote to make a difference. And I have consistently held that belief, regardless of what the horrific things that have been done to me, how my civil rights have been violated, and everything else. And I've even found evidence that Montana tampers with the voting record. So it's like, you don't even really know if what I'm doing is having any effect, but by golly, I'm not going to sit back and say, well, it might not make a difference, so I'm not going to try. You have to try. You have to vote. Can't stress that enough. If you have the power to vote, vote. But that said, just because in Montana is a little bit more liberal, even on probation and parole, I can vote. I'm on probation. I can vote. Don't get me started on the fact I'm not supposed to be on probation. Another subject for another time. Many states in the United States, they never lose their voting right. They can vote while they're in jail. They get a ballot in jail, they can vote. But many never get restored at all. In fact, Virginia and Kentucky, felons never get their voting rights back. It's a lifetime disenfranchisement. You get convicted of a felony at 18, 16, whatever, for the rest of your life you can't vote. How's that for civil rights? How's that for a democracy? By virtue of you committing a crime once in your life, you will never be able to vote. Ever. How's that? Great country, huh? This means that even if I were to move to Kentucky, don't plan to move to Kentucky. Anyone in Kentucky, don't start raising your torches and getting out your pitchforks and standing at the state line and watching against me invading your state. I'm not coming there. But hypothetically, if I were to move there, I couldn't vote. I've been convicted of a felony in Montana. If I were to go to Kentucky, I could not vote for the rest of my life, so long as I stay within the state of Kentucky. Congratulations. Can't run for public office. In most cases, most states, there is one restriction or another on running for public office. In Montana, you can't hold public office until you're released from supervision. So I can't run for office. I've often, when I encourage people to do protest votes, I point that out to them. Write my name as a protest vote, because while I'm under state custody, I can't hold office. So you're not voting for me. You're not going to install me into a position of power or authority. You're just protesting. At least until I get released from supervision, which right now is looking like at least another 2.5 years or so down the line. So 2.5 more years. Of course, as always, unless they find a way to revoke me, make up a new crime, find another reason to throw me back into prison, and restart the clock all over again. They've tried it twice. There's no guarantee they won't try it again. I live in the fear of that every single day of my life. I didn't commit the first crime I was thrown in prison for. I have absolutely no faith they will not make up another crime if they feel that my presence out here is more of a risk than my silence behind a cell wall. It's just the way it is. In fact, when I actually filed my recent petition for conditional release, which, by the way, is still pending, the state has not filed an objection to it. However, it's up to a very biased and bigoted judge, Heidi Albright, who has made it very clear that she doesn't care what evidence I present to her. It doesn't matter what truths I give to her. She's going to do everything in her power and abuse her power to make sure I don't go free and to make sure she imposes the harshest restrictions on me she can. There is a lawsuit pending since 2007 in her court for my business assets and property held by my ex-girlfriend Mara. That every record in the state supports the business was mine. She took them. 2007, the recording of this, it's the end of 2021, almost 2022, and Heidi Albright will not let this case go to trial. Why? because she knows there is absolutely no way a jury can look at the records and decide that Mara did not steal the business while I was thrown in prison. There's no way to look at it. Every record in the state shows it's mine. Every record. She has no records whatsoever. Heidi Albright knows this and knows if it's put in front of a jury, the jury has no choice. Mara has no evidence whatsoever that the business was ever hers. One thing I'll say about Montana records, at least the state level, not the county level, the state level, is they are all online. And for what it's worth, no one in the state executive branch has demonstrated an interest in tampering with records. But I've got the scanned records. I've got the saved files. I've got the certifications. If they went back at this point in time and changed the records, they'd have a real problem. Because I already have the certified records that demonstrate that this was how it was. This was my business. This is all of it. They can't go back on that at this point. Unless they're going to say that the previous Secretary of State who issued these was committing a crime themselves, which they're not going to turn on themselves. It's just too far afield. There's nothing they can do. That's why Heidi Albright will not let this case go to trial. You put it in front of a jury, it's impossible for the jury to reach any other decision. It's just impossible. Guys, ladies and gentlemen, my kitty cat has decided to come up and say hello. Say hello, Felicia. Yes, Felicia has come to say hello because she wants attention. Yes. I love Felicia. Come on, girl. Go on over there. Alrighty. As you all know, anyone who's watched the podcast, occasionally my cats decide they want to have fun and jump in the middle of the video screen. Well, Felicia has decided that she wants to right now, and it looks like she's not going to lose interest in it. So I apologize if she gets in front of the screen again. But anyway, on the subject of Montana offices, like I said, in Montana, I can't hold a public office. Public records makes it incredibly hard to even get support to run. I can't run office until I'm out of office supervision. Application for office requires disclosure of my felony record, just like it requires disclosure of a lot of personal information. So the moment I try to enlist and run for office, it's used against me. If I'm running against a political opponent, they're going to have all kinds of money built up keeping a felon out of office. And that will be the central theme. It won't matter whether the positions I take are legitimate or lawful or even represent the majority of the will of the state. It will be used against me, saying you don't want a felon, a sex offender, in office. Because it's prejudicial, it's bigotry, and that's what it is. It prevents felons from holding office. But public policy and practical application of how it's done. Felons are prevented from traveling abroad in many cases. Most states do not impose post-sentence travel restrictions from traveling outside the country. Many countries simply will not accept felons. Okay, Felicia, you need to stop, sweetheart. Come on. Go on down there, baby girl. Okay. They simply won't accept them. You're required to disclose you're a felon. And when you're required to disclose you're a felon, countries have the right to refuse you. Canada won't accept you if you have any kind of a DUI on your record. Any kind, whether it be misdemeanor or otherwise. They won't accept you if you have a DUI. DUI is driving under the influence. In some states called driving while intoxicated. But Canada won't accept you. They won't accept you across the border. Many countries around the world have specific restrictions and prohibitions against any felons of any kind entering their country. Which means if you want to travel to a country that has this prohibition, you can't travel there. You cannot leave the United States to go to one of these countries. It doesn't matter whether you're innocent. It doesn't matter if it's an overcriminalized justice system. It doesn't matter how exorbitantly outrageous the United States is in prosecuting the most ridiculous crimes, or even if it's a crime in their country. The fact is, it's a felon. It's a felony. It's on your record, and as a consequence, you cannot enter their country. So that absolutely affects you. Once again, look at the person who has a doobie in their pocket at 16. Turn around, they want to travel to a country that has a specific prohibition against felons when they're 30. Can't enter the country because 16 years ago you had a marijuana joint in your pocket. It may be legal in that country, but because it's a felony, you can't enter it. Firearms. I mean, let's look at this one. Not all countries allow for the use of possession of weapons. The United States does. However, in Montana, most felons although their rights are restored to them after they serve their sentence. Many felons, including violent offenders and sex offenders who are required to register, have a lifetime ban. And I say lifetime ban because technically the law says that while you're required to register. Registration is an automatic lifetime requirement unless you can petition the court to relieve you of the requirement. I have yet to meet a single Montanan who has tried to get released from registration and been granted it in Flathead County. I can't speak for the rest of the state. I really don't have a whole lot of feelers out there for this particular thing, but I've spoken to a whole lot of people who are both on the violent offender registry and the sex offender registry. Flathead County, to the best of my ability to determine, has never released anybody from the registration requirement. Never. And I've talked to a lot of people who've tried. They have gone back, they have petitioned the court has rejected it every single time. Not because it's not appropriate, not because the person has not proved they've been rehabilitated, but because they don't want to release you. Now, this gets into a whole discussion of Eighth Amendment violations, because we're talking about a lifetime imposition of a sentence that the Montana Supreme Court has defined as a civil regulatory scheme. Anybody who's listening, instead of watching the actual video, I just used air quotes. A civil regulatory scheme is when it's outside the criminal justice system, and therefore it doesn't qualify as double jeopardy, it doesn't qualify as cruel and unusual punishment, because it's a civil regulatory issue. It's civil, and therefore it's not criminal. Yeah, it's criminal, ladies and gentlemen. You are imposed on it as a penalty for your crime. You violate it, you go to prison. It is a criminal penalty. But they get away with it in Montana because they just call it civil. It goes back to my all-time favorite quote. If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck, even if it's holding a sign saying it's a chicken. Favorite quote ever. But it's true. You can call it whatever you want to call it. You can call it purple leprechaun graffiti for all you care. You can call it whatever you want. It is not a civil regulatory scheme. It is a criminal imposition. It is imposed upon an individual as a penalty to a crime. Has a criminal penalty to it if you violate it. It is not a civil regulatory scheme. It's a criminal penalty imposed upon you. It absolutely violates the imposition of cruel and unusual punishment. It absolutely violates double jeopardy. Absolutely. Montana wants to have more power. Again, they want to have reasons to throw you back in jail. If you miss your registration, you're a criminal. If you leave the state and don't report where you are, if somebody comes from out of the state and doesn't register because they don't recognize Montana's rules for when they have to register, it's a criminal. They can throw people in jail. The more people they can throw in jail, remember, not a civil regulatory scheme. Criminal. You can call it whatever you want. It is not a duck, or it is not a chicken, ladies and gentlemen. It is a duck. It is a crime. It is a criminal penalty. It is absolutely not a chicken. It is a duck. It walks like a duck. It looks like a duck. And it quacks like a duck. It's a duck. But because of this registration issue, you start getting into these issues to where the person, it's a lifetime imposition. You can never possess a weapon because of it. Additionally, even if you fall outside the requirements and you can get your weapon rights restored under Montana law, here comes the federal law. It says that if you're a felon, you don't get to have a gun at all. And don't even get me started on the sovereignty of the states and the imposition of federal authority on state territories. That's a subject for another podcast. But suffice to say, that's another example of overcriminalization from the federal side. The federal government is not supposed to be able to tell the state territories how to govern their territories. They do it all the time. The federal prison system as it exists is unconstitutional. Again, subject for another podcast. But let's just point out the very clear fact that by virtue of being a felon, you are never going to be able to possess a gun in the United States again, not legally. You might be able to possess it under Montana law, but it's not the feds for coming in and grabbing you. They can come in the state territory and they can grab you. and they can violate you. Just like with marijuana. Marijuana is now legal in the state of Montana, or will be as of January 1st, a few days away. As of the 1st of January, it will be legal once again. Or I should say, it was legal for medical marijuana cards as of a couple of years ago. Now it's going to be legal for everybody. They're going to tax the holy bloody, you put a proper expletive in there as you choose. They're going to charge a 20% tax on marijuana. 20% tax. Insane tax. Just because they can. But it's going to be legal. But guess what? The United States Supreme Court has said the states may legalize it. The federal government, which still considers it illegal, can still come in and bust you for it. So it doesn't matter if the state says it's legal. If the federal government wants to come in and charge a penalty upon you for it, they can still pick you up, put you in federal prison for it. So there's no protection, there's no shelter, there's no anything. If they want to come after you, they can come after you because they are the feds and they can go into the states and do it. And the United States Supreme Court has said they can. Obviously a decision I don't agree with. Once again, I want to reiterate, I don't use marijuana. I don't do drugs. I don't even drink. I don't smoke cigarettes. I don't do any of that. But I'm 150% behind people's rights to choose, so long as they can govern their lives. The moment they start losing control of their lives, the addiction gains more control over them, more traction. They're unable to work. They're unable to maintain proper social relationships. They start falling into criminal behavior in order to support their habit. Clearly, that's when you start breaking the mold. Even with alcohol. When someone's driving under the influence, alcohol may be legal, being intoxicated may be legal, but the moment you start getting behind the wheel of a vehicle and you start driving and putting other people at risk because you're not in control of your proper faculties, it's a crime. And that's how I think drugs should be treated. I think they should be regulated. I think they should be controlled by the government under the pharmaceutical side of it. Taxed, not 20%, but taxed. Supported, and then if the person is out in the community and not doing it properly, not behaving themselves, not conducting themselves in a safe manner for others around them, then yes, at that point in time, a social protection needs to be imposed. Protecting social society and its structures, protecting other people from harm. Absolutely. I just don't think the system as it exists, obviously, is proper. But once again, I'm really going off the rails tonight on tonight's subject. I'm having a really hard time sticking to the script. But let's just press forward. As I mentioned, let's not even go any further into state sovereignty. It does need to be an issue for another podcast, but I will come back to it at some point. Whenever I catch up on everything else, I keep saying I'm going to do. Jury service. In Montana, you are absolutely forbidden for life to serve on a jury. And I can give you the law. It's Montana Code Annotated 315-303, subsection 2. It clearly states that a person convicted of a felony is not competent to sit as a juror in Montana. You're not competent by virtue of your felony conviction, or if you hold a misdemeanor for conduct in office. You're not fit. If you've been convicted of a crime, you cannot sit as a peer over another person accused of a crime. You cannot come in with your own insights in the criminal justice system, how it works, how fair it is, how unfair it is, and apply your honest and genuine perceptions of how the system works and doesn't work and tries to give that person a fair shot. You are deprived that opportunity. How's that fair? What better peer could a person accused of a crime have than a person who has previously been accused of a crime and or convicted of that crime? I mean, what better peer can you have than somebody who's already been where you are? Most states prohibit felons from being on juries. Some offer varying degrees of it. Maine, for example, does not restrict felons from juries at all. Most states have some kind of an imposition. Most states actually just ban it outright. Felons can't serve on juries. Then we've already talked about this issue, employment. Felons suffer from background checks. Every employer these days do background checks. I don't care if you're working at McDonald's, you're working a construction job, You're applying for a job in the state senate. As a floor sweeper, you have a background check. Background checks turn up criminal convictions. They even turn up criminal, even if you haven't been convicted, many background checks will turn up that you were charged with a crime. Doesn't matter whether you were convicted, just that you were charged. Financial, security, and healthcare are many fields denied to felons outright. You cannot go work in a bank. You cannot go work as a security guard. You cannot go work in the healthcare field if you're a felon. 99% of the time. Felons are often denied advancements or positions of authority. By virtue of them being felons, they're not promoted to be managers. They're not being promoted to higher levels within the firm or agency or company they're working for. They're simply denied opportunities. They're passed over. They're denied wage increases oftentimes, or their wage increases are proportionately smaller than what their coworkers receive. Felons tend to receive lower pay than non-felons as a general rule. There's a 2018 report by Adam Loomy and Nicholas Turner that put out some of these statistics out, and they're just absolutely sobering to hear this. 1/3 of 30-year-old unemployed men in the United States, and this is, by the way, remember, this is 2018, it's only 3 years ago. 1/3 of 30-year-old men that are unemployed are either in prison, jail, or they're ex-prisoners who don't have employment. 1/3 of the employment rate of 30-year-olds in the country. Half of ex-prisoners do not report income for several years after release. They can't find work. They can't report income they do not receive. So it's not at all fair. Not only do they get less wages, they can't find work to begin with. And they have to the reason why they oftentimes have to settle for lower wages is because they take whatever jobs they can get. Individuals with criminal records are less likely to be employed, worsening the economic disparities and increasing recidivism. 1/3 of released people who get released from prison return to prison at some point in their lives. 1/3, 33% of people released from prison go back to prison. And it's oftentimes because they don't have the social, economic opportunities that non-felons have. And that leads to recidivism in order to try to support themselves, and which returns them to prison for one crime or another. It's a completely unbalanced system. You're set up to fail. There's very few support structures. The ones that do exist are temporary at best. You simply do not have the support structures that exist that are needed to take this. And remember, this is all public information. The moment you become an accused person, your public record. Anybody can look up your record and find out you were accused. If some guy ends up dead at the bottom of my stairs and the police accuse me and arrest me and put me in jail, even if somebody comes forward and says, hey, you know what? Yeah, that guy was attacking me. He was mugging me. I stabbed him and he staggered into that door. It must have been where he staggered. I didn't realize it. Self-defense, dude. I'm still in prison. They may release me, whatever. Congratulations. That accusation is on my record for the rest of my life. Regardless of whether I'm convicted or not, it's on my record. Background check. I was arrested for murdering a guy. I mean, let's face it, it sucks. I mean, and even if you do get employment, public housing benefits, all denied to felons on a regular basis. And the ones that do get services get reduced services or less sentences. They're sentenced to bureaus or to low-income neighborhoods. They're certainly not allowed to live in the rich, well-to-do neighborhoods. Oftentimes, background checks are used here as well. They exclude felons from rental properties, from purchasing properties in certain neighborhoods. Homeowner associations deny felons access to housings in their communities on a regular basis. They're often excluded from buying homes at all. I mean, you go and try to buy a home and the seller says, I don't want to sell to a felon. Boom, congratulations. You can't even buy a house in some neighborhoods or just some communities. They don't want you there. They can exclude you, and the government does absolutely nothing to protect the civil liberties here. Sometimes this is government-supported conditioning. Oftentimes it's privately enforced and ignored. I myself have tried to get into Section 8 HUD housing. It's housing and urban development for anybody who doesn't know what HUD is. It's supposed to be available for anyone for low income. I live on disability as a consequence of my rheumatoid variant disease. I have a chronic joint pain disease I'm going to live with for the rest of my life. It gets worse every year. This morning I woke up, I couldn't even breathe. Not because my lungs are bad, but because my sternum got inflamed. I couldn't take a deep breath. It felt like there was a 20-pound weight on my chest. It took most of the day before I could actually get my breath. I was actually wondering if I was going to get my breath back in time to actually do tonight's podcast. But I have this chronic joint pain disease that will be with me the rest of my life. There is no cure for it. It's a degenerative disease. Therefore, I'm on disability. I've been trying to use my publishing to get off disability. After 10 years, I still have not succeeded, but I'm still working at it. But that's not the point. The point is, I more than qualify because of my economic status, but because of my felony status, I'm not eligible in Kalispell for Section 8 housing. Not because HUD has made the rule, but because the local people who own the property made the rule, and HUD will not overturn it. They give the property owner the latitude to make that decision, even if it's invidiously discriminatory. That's probably a term I need to explain. Invidious discrimination is actually where a group of people or a class of people are denied certain civil liberties or civil rights under the law. Probably another subject for another podcast. I keep saying that. There are so many subjects out there to talk about, but if I go into that one, I'm going to go incredibly long on this one. Suffice it to say, it takes a group of people and it denies them equal access to the law, equal access to fair housing, equal access to federal funding for that fair housing. And the people who own the properties are allowed to continue to discriminate in this capacity because the federal government simply sits back and says, we don't care. Then, of course, we're talking about families. Families are torn apart by this. Felons are denied their parental rights. They're denied parental benefits. Oftentimes they're denied access to visitation while still being imposed with child support and other medical, let's pay for medical insurance, let's pay for the kid's schooling, whatever, but you can't see your kid. You can't communicate with your kid, but you're still going to be held accountable for this. And of course, the irony is they don't get employment as readily as a non-felon. They don't get paid as much. And felons are often required to pay more in child support by virtue of their conviction. You know, you should have more of a financial obligation to the child because you're not in the child's life. I mean, come on, how's that fair? The felon may want to very much be involved in that child's life, but is denied it because the court is bigoted against them. It's biased against them. How does child custody have anything to do with whether you've been convicted of a crime or not in the past? Unless it's a specific crime against that child, that should not have any effect. And even then, a parent should have a right to rehabilitation and reconditioning and allow for a reestablishment of a relationship with their child. But oftentimes felons are denied access to their children altogether and their families as a whole by virtue of their criminal convictions alone. The courts deny it. They don't care. In other words, even the least felony can hold a lifetime of consequence. The Eighth Amendment of the United States Constitution says excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. And what does the Supreme Court consider cruel and unusual punishment? That's the key here. Is lifetime imposition of a penalty of a consequence for a crime not cruel and unusual? No, the U.S. Supreme Court in a nutshell has said the cruel and unusual punishment clause of the United States Constitution measures a particular punishment against society's prohibition against inhuman treatment. It prevents, in other words, the government from imposing a penalty that's either barbaric or far too severe for the crime committed. I just listed off a host of penalties that felons endure regardless of what the felony is. And, of course, many classes of felons endure even harsher penalties like violent offenders, sex offenders, people who commit specific crimes such as murder or commit drug-related offenses are often given even harsher penalties than what a standard felon would endure. Society turns a blind eye to how felons are treated after their release. They turn a blind eye to the conditions and restrictions that people, and I emphasize people, are put under on a regular basis. They don't care. People tend to see a prison sentence as being the end. It's not. Even people who do not see prison are often forever scarred by the record, regardless of whether they're convicted or not convicted. Even if they get straight probation for their crime, they still have to report and disclose their conviction. Background checks turn them up regardless. There's very little true rehabilitation in the United States. Only cruel and unusual punishment, social isolationism, and of course a host of restrictions that are both imposed by the government and imposed by society the government does nothing to restrict. In effect, this creates a caste system of undesirables who are denied common civil rights, human dignity, and any kind of civility and treatment as human beings. Of course, most people released from prison fall into common supervision, whether it be probation or parole. So even before you're released from supervision, you have even more penalties imposed upon you, even massive more penalties imposed upon you just for being under supervision. I mean, community supervision often imposes such great restrictions as you can't drink, you can't gamble, you can't go certain places, you can't go to public events, you can't go to the fair, for example. My probation officer was actually trying to prevent me from going to the emergency room at one point. The emergency room. Because he can. He tried to impose a condition over me that I could not go any place where there's a reasonable expectation that a child could be present. That is literally everywhere. Tried to impose it. Thank goodness that particular condition was shot down, but I was still forced to live under it for over a year as I waited for the court to issue a final order. Even though not confined in a cell, still probationers and parolees are absolutely prisoners of the state. They cannot travel. They cannot leave the area of their confinement. They cannot hold certain jobs, certain positions. They can have certain contact with certain members of society. They have restrictions upon where they can and cannot go. They are absolutely prisoners. In my case, I just finished a new book, my 25th book, my 11th novel. Just getting ready to publish it, working with the cover artist, fantastically happy with that. My editor's almost done with my editors, plural, are almost done with their reviews of the books. And they'll be coming back to me here very soon. I'll be able to incorporate the final edits. I'll be able to bundle it. I could have this out as soon as the first week of the new year. Restrictions govern where I can promote. I can't go to certain bookstores. If I do go and do a book signing, I have to have someone with me, acting as essentially a guardian to make sure I don't do something inappropriate. I'm in freaking public. I'm in the public. I mean, what? I'm not going into a back room and saying, "Hey, come back in the back room and I'll sign your book for you." I'm on a table in the middle of a mall or in front of a store. How could I possibly need to do anything? Why do we need a chaperone? I have to have somebody supervising me at all times if I'm in the public. I can't leave the state to promote. I can't go to, for instance, I can't go contact B. Dalton booksellers and say, "Hey, I'd like to do a promotional chain through your company and go all across the country and Canada and everywhere else and promote my book with you," because I can't leave Montana. And then, of course, you have the background checks. Once again, that infamous background check. They've actually barred me from distributors for my books. There's actually distributors will actually ask for a resume. They will do a background check on people, on the author, and they will decide based on a background check whether they're even going to carry your book. The lovely line that keeps coming back is, "We have no wish to affiliate with someone with your background." No wish to affiliate. I'm selling a book. You're carrying my book. You're putting my book in a bookstore. You're not endorsing me. You're not endorsing my criminal record. You're not endorsing anything beyond the fact that here's a book for sale. We have no wish to affiliate with you because of your background. Lifetime penalty, ladies and gentlemen. Even after I'm off of probation, that will always be there. There's no shelter or protection from these kinds of restrictions. Government creates an inherent pariah syndrome against felons. It's a pariah caste. It's below the most impoverished individual in the country. There's your felons. In other countries, it's actually against the law to release the names of the accused or convicted people. But As I mentioned before, we have a mass media industry here that profits off of it. There's no opportunity to advance, kept forever in poverty, treated as subhuman. Even after you've served your sentence, you've done your civil service or whatever you want to call it. You've served your time. You've done all your you've served your debt to society, or however you want to phrase it. You've done your time for your crime, and you still are going to always suffer because the United States sits here and continues to victimize and re-victimize criminals, or people they call criminals. Many of these people, remember, are forced into plea bargains to plead guilty to something just to try to get their lives back. They're not guilty. Not everyone accused is guilty. And there's absolutely no consideration or possibility in anybody's mind that that possibility could even exist. There are federal incentives to hire individuals with felonies, but very few people are able to take advantage of them because of the structures and the rules set up for them. They publicize them, they do a whole lot of PR on them. There's a reason why over half the people released from prison don't report income for several years after they get released. Just as felons are not fit to serve on juries, institutions set felons up to fail. They make it incapable for a felon to even affect change to the wrongs they've experienced. They can't sit on a jury and use their personal insight into the criminal justice system to make sure the person that's on trial is actually being treated fairly. They can't get into public office in most cases simply because their background will be used against them. While they're serving, they certainly cannot, even if they're serving only under supervision. They can't hold a job in public office. Why? It's a job. It's doing public, most offenses actually require community service. Why can't community service be actually holding a public office? Why? Because the government does not want felons to actually influence policy and actually fix the problems that are in the system. The people who are making these rules are not the people suffering under them. The bottom line is it makes these people who impose these outrageous restrictions, who have none of them of their own, it makes them powerful, it makes them untouchable, because it puts the undesirables that they punish, that they penalize, that they push down into a socioeconomic cage that very few can break out of. It sets people up to fail. They can't break out. Not everybody is as well versed as I am. Not everybody is willing to stand up and say the things I'm willing to say. Not everyone's willing to go out there and actually do the research and take the time to actually do this. And yet still, in spite of my voice, in spite of my intelligence, in spite of the fact that I'm right in what I am saying and I am speaking only the truth, I am here today telling you I am still a political prisoner in Montana. And I have been for almost 18 years. And I will continue to be even if I manage to get to that magical day of February 17th, 2024, and I get released from custody. I will still be a pariah. I will still have restrictions and limitations imposed upon me for the rest of my life because of a crime I never committed. A crime that was imposed upon me because the people who imposed it were the people who were actually breaking the law, committing the crimes, and they didn't want to answer for their own, so they put me under an undesirable label to make sure no one listened to me. Let us not forget, this is the best way to hide a political prisoner. If you want to hide a political prisoner, use your power to manipulate a conviction of a heinous crime or even an accusation of it. It doesn't even have to be conviction, just accuse them of it. Put it out there in the court of public opinion. Then no one will listen to them. Once they've been accused of a heinous crime, once they've been convicted of a heinous crime, even worse, they lose all clout. Nobody wants to listen to them. I hope you're listening now. I hope you're listening because this is a wake-up call. This is what happens. This is the kind of people. This is what could happen to you. What happened to me can happen to you. And if you don't think it can, I didn't either. Thank you for listening. As always, once again, if you like the video, you're watching it on YouTube, like and subscribe, share it. Obviously, that applies to any platform on which you're watching this. If you want to support our cause, please look at the text attached to this video. If for some reason that text is not attached to this video, do visit the home site of this. You can either visit me on YouTube, or you can go visit me on YouTube and look for the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast. You'll want to put it in quotes because for whatever reason, those words alone just get like 50 different hits and you won't end up. Make sure you put it in quotes. But obviously, feel free to go to the original source of this podcast, which is monspiracy.podbean.com. As always, I do hope everyone out there is safe, and whenever possible, please be free. Thank you.